We'll make a start. I think nearly everyone's here, otherwise we'll get caught behind. So this session is just going to give you an introduction about classification. Just going to go over a bit of the history of classification, talk about how it's evolved from being very medical to now being sports specific, and then to go through the steps on how we do classification. So just to give you some history, the Paralympics started after World War II, where sports were used as a form of rehabilitation for soldiers who were wounded, and mainly people with spinal cord injury. And so this gentleman here, I should remember his name, Ludwig Guttmann. He started the Paralympics by promoting sport for people with spinal cord injury. So it all started really for wheelchair athletes, and over time there started to be some other athletes, so athletes with amputations or cerebral palsy. So the Paralympics actually hasn't been around for all that long, and a lot of changes have happened during that time. So it started off being very medical. So if you had a spinal cord injury, all of those athletes would compete together. And if you had an amputation, then all of those athletes would have competed together. But then as there became more athletes, they started to group them according to their function. So an example here is that you might have an amputee who would compete in a wheelchair, and you might have someone with a spinal cord injury that would compete in a wheelchair. So it was a very functional way of looking at the classes, so they would group them together in that way. But then the games continued to grow. And so where we're at now is that we're actually looking at a classification system that's a lot more sports specific. And to go along with that, there's a new code. So I think the first code was written in 2005 from memory, I believe, and it's just now been recently reviewed. But now all sports need to have what's called as a sports-specific evidence-based classification system, which you might appreciate can be quite difficult when we actually have a very mixed group of athletes. So we see athletes just not only with amputees, spinal cord injury, cerebral palsy, spina bifida. You can imagine all the different kinds of athletes that we see with different kinds of impairment. So now it's important that we look at those athletes and we group them according to what their limitation is with the sport. So classification not only exists within the Paralympic movement, but you would actually see it in other sports as well. So people can be classified according to their weight, or they might be classified according to their gender. So we have male and female athletes that compete differently. And we might also have athletes that are pooled according to their age. So the differences are that you can be selective, or it could be based on performance. But for classification, we're really looking at it's very selective. So we're grouping athletes according to what their limitation is with the sport. So the goal with classification is that we really want to minimise the impact of the impairment on competition. We want to try and group athletes together so that it creates a level playing field, and so that the outcome, the winner, it's really dependent on the level of training that they do, not because of the kind of impairment that they have. I think this is a really important piece of information to understand. So each sport can be very different. And what you'll learn today, over the weekend, is that we're doing Nordic, Alpine and snowboarding. So those sports, a little bit similar. But if you look at the bigger picture of Paralympic sports, I use the example in archery, for example. Archery, if you're missing a hand and you do archery, that's quite an activity limitation. Agree? But if you do a marathon run and you're missing a hand, the limitation is quite different. So every sport is different. And so an athlete might be classed in one class for one sport, but it could be very different for another. So again, it's coming back to what is the activity limitation? Going through this very quickly. So there are 3 steps to athlete evaluation, and this is what's really going to help shape for the rest of the weekend. Certainly for those people who are wanting to become international classifiers. So the 3 steps being, first, do they have an eligible impairment? And then, do they actually meet what the minimal impairment criteria is? And then we're looking at what class they go in. So we'll just go into these in a little bit more detail. So within the Paralympics, these are all the different kind of eligible impairments. So PI stands for physical impairment. So we have limb deficiency, leg length difference, impaired muscle power, impaired range of movement, passive range of movement, and then you have ataxia, hypotonia, athetosis, or short stature. Then we have visual impairment, so that's VI. We're not going to do visual impairment, sits outside of what we're doing this weekend, and as does intellectual impairment. So with all the sports that compete under the Paralympic umbrella, these are the eligible impairment types. So for alpine, Nordic and snowboarding, we're just looking at the physical impairments. So when we look at alpine skiing, you'll notice that the only physical impairment that's not eligible is the short stature. All other physical impairments are eligible. We do have visual impairment, which Dimitri spoke about, but we're not here to be trained to become visual VI classifiers. And in alpine, we don't have intellectual impairment. So we're just then looking at the first column this weekend, where we're looking at limb deficiency, leg length difference, impaired muscle power, impaired passive range of movement, and then ataxia, hypotonia, athetosis. Now it's exactly the same for snowboarding, except in snowboarding we don't have visual impairment, but the physical impairments remain the same. Nordic, we're missing the slide for Nordic, sorry Nordic.
It's the same.
So Nordic skiing is exactly the same as alpine, but of course we're not doing VI this weekend, but the physical impairments are the same.
Perhaps it's good if everyone understands what is the difference between an impairment and the diagnosis.
Yeah.
Diagnosis
Yeah.
is an easy word.
So I can maybe go on to that on this form here. So the first thing that we try and establish is if someone has an eligible impairment. And we do that by all athletes have to complete the medical diagnostic form. And that's where having the background of being a doctor or a physiotherapist, you have an understanding of what can be the different impairments. But an example here might be that you can have someone who has a spinal cord injury, so that's what we would call the health condition. You can have someone who has a spinal cord injury and they can walk very well with next to no impairment. Do people understand that that could be the case? You could also have a spinal cord injury and use a wheelchair and have no movement in your legs. So just because you have a spinal cord injury doesn't mean that you meet an impairment. Okay, and that's an important thing to understand. Just because you have a certain health condition, so for example spinal cord injury, doesn't necessarily, it has to result in one of those impairments in that column. So a spinal cord injury, as an example, would commonly lead to impaired muscle power. Sometimes you can get a neurological assessment where there might be hypertonia. But if someone has written spinal cord injury on their form, on here, you think, yeah, they might be eligible, but what I have to know is that it results in an impairment. And there would be other health conditions that are similar to that. Okay, so does that explain that? Yeah. So we get athletes to fill out this diagnostic form, and it needs to be supported with medical documentation as well. So already when we receive this form, we have a reasonably good understanding of where this athlete might fit. But it's only the very, this just enables someone to then come to classification. Sometimes we get this form and we can say already, say it says, for example, that they've lost one finger and they want to be a snowboarder. Well, we can say, sorry, that's not going to meet minimal impairment. So when you start to understand what the minimal impairments are for the classes or for the sports, then this form will be a lot more useful to you. Any questions on this form? Step 1. So you've received the form and you think, yes, this person could be eligible. So now we need to see whether they meet minimal impairment criteria. And to do that, that's where you do your assessment. So you've received the form and now you're going to do a physical assessment to see whether they meet the minimal impairment criteria. So each sport, as I described before, the example of someone missing a hand, I actually don't know what the rules are for archery and marathon running, but each sport will be different because the impairment, the activity limitation can be different. So in alpine and snowboarding and Nordic, we have minimal impairment criteria for each of those eligible impairment types. I'm just going to go back. So for limb deficiency, leg length difference, in that list, we have criteria for the minimal impairment. And that's what you'll learn this weekend. And it's one of the key things to learn as well. Certainly if you're just classifying at a national level and you might have a patient or you've met someone in the ski school and they just want to have an understanding whether they might be eligible for parasports. If you can at least determine if they meet the minimal criteria, then that will help get them to the next step. Okay, so understanding minimal impairment criteria is important. So each sport is different, and you'll learn this weekend that alpine skiing is different to snowboarding. So just an example there, athletes with a limb deficiency must have amputation through the ankle or below the elbow. But in snowboarding, we're just looking at also that they have, so in, I don't want to complicate it too much now, but in alpine, when we look at the upper limb, the athlete must demonstrate that they can't hold and use a pole. So they might have some hand, but in snowboarding, they must have no hand at all. So the two sports are different. So you determine whether someone has minimal impairment criteria by doing your physical assessment, which we will start with this afternoon, but go into more detail tomorrow. And once you've determined that they've actually met minimal impairment criteria, then you think of what class they might go in. So we're going to go into a lot more detail about all the different classes that exist in alpine, snowboarding and Nordic. But the first thing is to really establish whether A, they're eligible, And then B, if they are, what class will they go into? And so in Alpine we have different classes to snowboarding and again to Nordic. And we try and create those classes according to what the activity limitation is on the snow. The Alpine classes have been around for a long time. As snowboarding with a new sport, we actually have less classes, so you'll start to see where the differences are. Does anyone have any questions about? Has anyone had any experience with classification, either as a coach, in other sports, or in your working profession? No one?
Yeah, there is one athlete here.
Where's the athlete? Is there an athlete here? I know that there's a coach here that's had experience. There we go. Yeah, behind the pole. Great. Well, that's good because you're going to learn a lot then. But this is just the real basics of what you need to understand. And these 3 steps. And again, even if you're just working at that the national level, if you just understand these 3 steps, then it will help put the potential athlete in a good position. So A, do they have an eligible impairment? Then B, does it meet the minimal impairment criteria? And then if it does, what class does it go into? And then also to understand that every sport is different. Because you'll have some athletes that will say, but I'm eligible for basketball, but I'm not eligible for athletics. Well, it's because basketball is a different sport to athletics. Okay, and not many people understand that either. And the other important thing, which I've already spoken about, is that just because you have a certain health condition, for example, spinal cord injury, doesn't necessarily mean that you have an impairment that will make you eligible. So for those that don't understand spinal cord injury, you have varying levels of severity. So you can have someone with a spinal cord injury that can walk very well with no loss of strength. And then you have someone who can have complete loss of strength. So just because on the form, if they've written spinal cord injury, doesn't necessarily mean that they might be eligible for the sport. So it's really important to understand, because some athletes will, or potential athletes will have high expectations, and then it becomes very difficult to explain that to the person. Okay, so if we can move on to the next one.
Okay. This is a video about alpine skiing, all different classes. Must have the sound a little bit lower, so that's better. It goes very fast, but you see, this is the visual impaired skiing. You see that they follow their guide, and they communicate through, most of them through Bluetooth, and some of them communicate through a speaker on their back, because that's easier for them to follow their guide. Then they have more idea of the surroundings. But you see also that as a guide, you must be a very good skier. So sometimes you have a couple that when the guide is not skiing as good enough, they have to change to a new guide. This is someone with spinal cord injury in a sit ski. And there you must see how they put the ski on the edge, what level of they use their body. Are they able to make lateral flexion at hip level or at shoulder level? That's an important difference. You see that this one is able to lay the ski very flat, and he is able to lift his pole, so he has quite a good sitting balance. Okay. This is someone skiing with an amputation, with a prosthetic. It's sometimes very difficult to see which leg is the affected one, but you must look at if there's the angle at the knee, because with a prosthetic you cannot bend that deep. And sometimes you see also that the weight shift is not as great, that they're skiing more on their able leg and less on their less able leg. But we had a few years ago Matthias Lansinger. He lost his leg as a World Cup skier, and then he started to ski as a para skier, and you could see the difference. Hemiplegia, so one side affected, that's easier to see. This case he's not able to use a pole, but when you look also at the leg, you'll see that he's not able to control his ski on the snow. Oh, this is now going very fast. Upper limb disability, you'll see that they're less able to balance and hit the gates. He has only one arm to do that. Okay, so this was a short impression of them. Then a short impression of the para snowboard. How does it go? Okay. It's not so very good to see. This is in Sochi, so I'll lose some part of it. This film is only with people with lower limb affected. This is in Sochi. We only had one class, only lower limb. Currently, it's split in lower limb 1 and lower limb 2, and lower limb 1 has more impaired. So most of them have an above knee amputation. So that we will see in another video later. You see more the difference between those classes. But when you look good, you see that one leg is not able to absorb as well as the other one on the snow. Also another one. Who's this? This Ben? Yeah. It's more cerebral palsy. It's not a very good video, I think. But certainly in snowboard now, it's sometimes very difficult to see which side is affected. He has a above knee, I think. Okay, we don't have Nordic here. No, so that's okay. I think a little bit enough from the snowboard. And then this is more an and here you see more an impression of all kinds of impairments. And when we show this video at the end of the weekend, you'll be able to see some of them directly. Oh, LW2, LW4, LW, then directly the class name. You see, it's a very high impact sport. There are some people who want to do the sport, say with hypermobility, and then they're angry on us that we don't allow them to come because hypermobility is not an eligible impairment. But then the next step is, I think it's also a sport medal. I think you have the impression about that there are really lots of different kinds of impairments, and that we still are able to have, with the classification, to get them in only 3 medal groups. Before, there were 18 medal groups, 19 medal groups, and you had to wait a whole day to have all the medals, but now you only have sitting, standing, and visual impaired. So I hope we can explain you that coming days. So this was a little bit, the next videos will come tomorrow, but for now it's, I think, enough. And then we can go on with the presentation.